My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast.
If you'd like to help us make more content, consider joining the Patreon. You can also bookmark our affiliate links to Amazon and DriveThruRPG to support the show with each purchase. Want a free way to help the show? Give it a review on your favorite podcast platform, or like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Finally, if you'd like to be on the show, or think you know a great guest, contact me on the Discord server or on Twitter. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Arcane Mirage with me. Welcome.
Hello, happy to be here.
Why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the tabletop role-playing space?
So I make maps, I make fantasy maps, mainly for D&D and other TTRPGs, of course. And I got started just because I was at a game night with some friends and I overheard them say dragons, and I told them whatever they're playing, I want to be involved. And they needed a healer, so I became the party healer. And probably about 6 months after that, I started DMing myself and decided I needed to make a homebrew world, and that's how I kind of started my first world and started mapping.
Nice. So was that first system D&D?
Yep, fifth edition.
Nice.
Uh,
That's a pretty classic gateway for most people.
mhm. I played a little bit of 3.5, but that campaign was very short, so I'm not too experienced with 3.5. So most of my last like 6 years or so of experience has been with fifth edition.
And it sounds like you switched over to becoming a dungeon master pretty quick. How was that transition?
It was very nerve-wracking. I mean, almost 6 years later, still get nervous DMing, but I DM for a bunch of friends, so they're all very encouraging. And I still was a player for a while, but learning all the rules from the DM side and finding out how much you have to actually do and prep and everything was very overwhelming at first, but I kind of found what worked for me.
And so how experienced were like the rest of the people with the game that you started playing with?
Most of them were all brand new. We only had one player really who was actually experienced whatsoever, and he grew up on it. His dad taught him how to play. So he was kind of our guide with it, and he was very familiar with other TTRPGs as well. So he kind of grew up in that world. Even our DM, she was brand new to it, so she was winging a lot of it, and it was a nice experience actually starting with other people that were brand new to it, so it wasn't as overwhelming as a new player because we're learning together.
Yeah, there's a little bit more of a forgivingness of it, I suppose. Whenever everybody's learning, you're not quite as worried as about getting everything right. But when you are in the on the dungeon master's side, it is easy to get overwhelmed and feel like you need to be the person that knows all of the rules since you're kind of running the game.
Oh, for sure. And I homebrew a lot of stuff, so my players kind of tease me because there's some rules I always have to have them look up for me because I'm so used to homebrewing it or just kind of making it up on the fly that there's just some rules in particular where I'm just like, I don't care, just whatever sounds good.
So tell me about the homebrewing and what you started doing there.
So I pretty much started with a homebrew. I've only tried a couple different modules and didn't like running something that was already kind of pre-written and players were familiar with because my players have always been experienced. I've only had a couple players over the years that were brand new to the game. So I've always wanted to do homebrew because it kind of introduces players to something new and different and also tones down metagaming as well, but keeps it interesting for seasoned players. So I like changing up the actual monsters and things like that and kind of trying to develop my own monsters for that fit the world itself or different types and things like that. I love homebrewing weapons and different magic items and things like that too.
Yeah, there's a fun creator aspect to being in the DM seat that you have a little bit more power to do some of those things.
It's a lot of fun. And especially since that's what kind of drew me to D&D to begin with and being a DM was I love storytelling. I like making stuff like that up and just the fantasy world in general. So that was kind of what made me want to be a DM is the actual homebrewing aspect of the game.
Do you have any favorite monsters, items, locations that you've homebrewed?
I would say my favorite item that I've kind of come up with, it's very mundane, but I use it in all my games that I've ran and everything. It's called Luminous Arcanum, and it's a crystal that basically glows. Then there's different types based on rarity, where they're located, where they grow. They grow in areas of high magic, so they're very abundant on the material plane, but other planes, they have more rare types that are kind of catered to the plane itself. And the more rare they are, the more valuable, of course, but they can be used as spell components as well. And if you use these as a spell component, it kind of alters the spell itself and makes it a little bit more potent. And depending on what type of crystal you use, it can also add additional types of damage to it as well. That's kind of always been a favorite in my world.
That's really cool. So then so I suppose as like a reward, you can kind of hand out these different like spell modifiers almost.
Yeah, and my players have kind of grown to know that if they're in caves or around those areas where there's like a wizard's council or something like that, where there's a lot of magic happening in one area, especially powerful magic, they know that they can mine for these different crystals and things like that. And they just received this big chunk of like the rarest one as payment for helping a king get through a castle siege.
That is really cool. How does that how does that affect the world building with by having those in your world, I guess?
Well, a lot of people use them in place of torches. They're a little bit brighter than torches, but they can only be snuffed out by actually being in some sort of magical bag or behind some kind of like in darkness, the actual spell.
Hmm.
So the blue colored ones are the most common. So they're found in a lot of households of like the elites in in the towns and city, the mayors and stuff like that. They can be found kind of in like the wizard schools and the council halls and things as almost relics, just kind of on display. So in certain areas, it kind of depends on where they're at. But in certain areas, like up in the mountains, the rarity kind of changes a little bit because it's not as rare in the mountains. So it might be more common to see one of the more rare crystals in houses instead of down by, the ocean where they're not near the mountain. So it kind of is interesting to see my players try to figure out what kind of crystals they're going to find and where and how the economy is going to be.
That's cool. So they're at least like low level ones, they're fairly common, or at least common enough that people would be using them as like you said, as torches, as lights, that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, for sure. They're found in most temples and things like that. Like you wouldn't get very much money out of selling these crystals or stealing them or anything like that. But say, the purple is one of the more rare ones found on the material plane. And those are found where portals are, where like portals grow and like where, you can accidentally step into the Feywild, that's where they kind of grow, where there's immense magic. Something
Sure.
like that, they know is worth quite a bit of money. And they found a chunk recently and traded it to a dragon in exchange for some powerful magic items.
And I assume so you mentioned the Feywild as being kind of like a crossover point into a magical area. I assume that they have slightly different effects and stuff as well, kind of related to like where they're coming from or what magic is kind of creating them.
Yeah, so if they're kind of found closer to something like a Fey portal or a Fey crossing, they if you use them as material as spell components for an actual spell, it'll kind of increase the chaos a little bit. My players haven't used any of the crystals yet as spell components, so I haven't gotten to play around with all types of crystals yet and kind of experience that. But I do plan on, it's going to cause basically a sense of wild magic to whatever spell they use. Like there's going to be an after effect if they're near the Feywild, or the ones found in the Underdark also will add necrotic damage to whatever spell they're doing, or will alter spells that do like more good aligned type magic, it'll kind of alter it to be more kind of corrupt in a way.
It'd be fun to have it like switch it. So if you had like a healing spell, but channeling it through that to make it cause damage instead of healing.
Oh, for sure, that would be fun. I'm sure that would make my players very upset, but it would be worth a laugh for me.
And you mentioned you do a lot of map making, and that's actually how I found you on TikTok. Do you want to talk about how you got started with your maps?
Yeah, so it was because I started DMing. I was running a homebrew world and decided, I looked at all these maps that people had for D&D in their worlds, and I had actually picked up the starter set that has Lost Mines of Phandelver in it and looked at those maps, and I thought they were just so cool. And I decided, my world needs a map. And then I started watching some tutorials, like other people's tutorials and things, and started with a very small regional area, and that was like my world for the longest time. And then I decided, it needs to be a little bit bigger. There needs to be more exploring going on. So I added a few pieces of paper to it, and it kept growing and growing. And even more recently, I've added to it even more. So now the world's even bigger, and there's so much to explore in it and everything. I'm really excited about that. And so and once I started making maps, I had other players that were DMs asking me to make maps for them, and that's actually how I found one of my players, one of my best friends. He's also a DM, one of my DMs and player in my game. And I found him because of mapping as well. He saw me post a map and started messaging me. We started talking about D&D and D and stuff, and he just kind of became a great friend. So it's led to many a good thing in my life.
I feel like I mean, I've had a similar experience with the podcast and with just running games in general. And I feel like it's a pretty common thread when I talk to people on here is that the community is usually really good and really nice to people, and a lot of people find a lot of great friends online that they maybe wouldn't have otherwise ran into.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, most of my friends I've made through D&D in one way or another. Like through another player or because I've gone to Adventures League at like the game shop, you know, a friend of a friend that plays D&D kind of a thing. So most of my friend group has I would not have them if it wasn't for D&D.
So have you been mapping about as long as you've been DMing?
Yeah, pretty much. I made my map pretty quickly. I think I was DMing only for maybe a few months, up to 6 months before I made my first map.
And most of your maps are hand drawn, correct?
Mhm. I do make digital maps as well, but hand drawn is kind of my niche. It's just what I really enjoy doing and prefer doing, but I do make digital maps as well, and that's just as fun, but I've found I'm just a little bit better at hand drawn, and I just like the look of it so much better or so much more. It's just what I kind of lean towards usually.
I know a lot of the videos that I've seen of yours online are just really cool to watch you draw out all of the little bits and as it, kind of see how it comes together. Do you have tips for people who are maybe interested into doing map making?
Yeah, my biggest one is just be patient. You develop your own style over time. Learning how to draw different things, just it takes time. A great way to start is just to look at other map makers, see if there's tutorials out there, because there's tons of tutorials. And that's just a fantastic way to start is to just kind of follow some tutorials. Just let your map making develop over time. Like we all start somewhere, practice. It doesn't make perfect, but practice does make better. The more you do something, the better you're going to get at it. And I know my first map wasn't the greatest. It's the assets on it, like the actual images were huge and very unproportioned, and I didn't understand scale. And over time, I've learned where to place things so it makes more sense. I've learned how to kind of make my trees look different depending on the areas, and I'm still learning. It's a process. And I don't think anyone, kind of gets to a point where they fully are like in a full understanding of how every little thing is gonna go on the map. It just kind of how it looks and develops over time. It's just something you got to be really patient with yourself with actually learning.
And you mentioned you started out with like a small region, and then that kind of grew into your kind of like your homebrew setting. Have you redrawn that map several times over the past few years as you've gotten better?
Yeah, I do really want to redraw the actual map with like my styles kind of has changed dramatically since I started, like since my first map was made to the map I made most recently. It looks like two completely different people did it. And but my old map has been incorporated into my new homebrew map. I basically redrew it for the most part and kind of broke up the different continents and moved them around to where I wanted them and then basically just redrew them on the new map. But I really haven't recently anyway redrawn the first original map in a new, like, copying it almost, but with the new style, and I really wanna do that soon.
I've had it in my mind for a while that I would like to take one of the walls, like in my office, and then like paint a map onto the wall, but I definitely don't have the skill to do that. So, but I think it'd be
I
so cool to have this just massive wall and then be like, "Oh, here's all of my places," and then just add things as you go.
Oh, 100%. I've strongly considered it, but I rent, so it'd be a bad idea.
Ooh,
How
yeah.
I think it would be fun to they make, like, peel and stick wallpaper. I thought about getting some of that and getting a blank one and then drawing a big map on the wall that way, but I still am kind of afraid to put anything on the wall like that since I do rent.
Wallpaper can be a little sketchy as well. We had to take a lot of wallpaper down when we moved into our current place.
Mhm.
Um, so it may be easier to just paint.
No, right, right.
So for let's maybe talk about some of your DMing. When you are going to run a game, what kind of prep do you do, and kind of how long does it take for you to prep for, say, an individual session that you're going to run?
It just kind of varies if like depending on how much about the player like what the players want to do, how much I actually know. I can do a lot of prepping and sometimes I'm prepping for so we have our games, sorry, I'm kind of all over the place, but we have our games twice a month back to back weekends. So I try to spend the 2 weeks off where we're not playing games and I will prep over the course of that time because I have a full-time job and with the mapping and things it kind of I can only prep here and there. But all in all, I mean, I can prep in a few hours. Sometimes I can't prep until the day of. And I try to not prep too much. I will try to prep things like speeches or big events like that where it's going to be more of a role play moment versus an actual like where they're rolling dice. I try to prep those moments so that they're kind of a little more cohesive and well, better put together. But for the most part, a typical session, I will try to have a list of like random names and things like that. But it's more of a like a skeleton of a plot line out like layout. So I'll have major points of like where I kind of want them to go, what might happen. But my players keep me on my toes and they tend to go complete left field anyway, so I've definitely toned it down from my prepping. I used to prep a lot. I would prep out full conversations when I first started, and now that I've got way more experience, I do not do that because it never plays out that way. And it also keeps me from railroading accidentally.
Yeah, prepping conversations is tricky because the players are almost never going to have the conversation that you planned for.
It's easier to prep a personality and kind of think of how they might react, like an NPC might react to different situations or different things being said to them. But for the most part, like our last session, I had a sentence prepped, and that was about it. And it was a very basic, generic sentence. Don't even remember what it was. I think it was just like an intro to, a recap and so the entire session we just had was complete improv, and I ended up fleshing out an entire NPC, an entire city, a bunch of different council members, just because I went with the flow with what the players wanted to do, and they did something. Had I prepped what I thought they were going to do, they ended up not doing, and they're not going to do for a little bit. So I would have wasted time actually prepping instead of just kind of letting things go and set their course in the campaign.
So it sounds like your games are very kind of sandboxy.
For the most part, there is an overarching plot. The way I started this campaign was I didn't have a BBG yet. I didn't really have an overarching plot. I didn't really know what to do with the campaign. I just knew I wanted to start a new fresh campaign. And I started it with I gave the players 5 bounties from a bounty board, and the campaign has taken its course, and we now have a BBG. There's now an overarching kind of a plot. There's a few things going on in game, and so I've got plenty to work with for quite some time, and it just started with some simple bounties.
Okay, so I really like this idea, and I feel like it comes I feel like sometimes maybe DMs or us as DMs tend to plan too much, and then there's always something that comes up in play where you're like, "Oh, this is better than anything I had planned." Can you talk about how you got your big bad out of some of the sessions? Because it, like you said, you didn't start with one, so I'm just
Mhm.
kind of curious how that progressed.
So one of the bounties that they started with is actually the big bad now, and they created him unintentionally. So he was
That's the
a
best.
yeah, right? And that's kind of how I wanted to design the BBG. So I was just kind of waiting to see what happened in the campaign before I decided on that. And so they had one of the bounties they had was a red dragonborn, and he was wanted for arson basically and the murder of a family. He was seen running from a scene of the crime, and because the place was burned and there was fire seen and he's a red dragonborn, it was kind of just assumed since he's running from it that, he was the cause of it, and there was a supposed eyewitness and everything else. Well, the party kind of investigated a little bit, and they came to realize that it wasn't the red dragonborn, he was being framed. It was actually a fire elemental that had been summoned. They found a summoning circle on top of the house. Like it was a whole thing. So they started exploring it, and they decided that they wanted to help him, and so they tracked him down, they found him. One of the party members was actually his tutor. So she knew him a little bit personally. And so when they found him, he was actually heavily injured. He was on the brink of death because he had been actually tracked down by the person who actually did commit the crime to keep him from telling people who the actual killer was and what they were after. It was like a whole thing. And so they found him blind, hurt, like it was the cleric ended up healing him, but ran out of spell slots before he could cure his blindness. And I think they kind of forgot or brushed off him being blind because they never healed that part. They went directly into they were trying to figure out what to do with him. They're like, "Well, we want to prove his innocence." The party was super split on what to do. Some of the party members wanted to turn him in, some wanted to hide him and take him with them. One of the party members wanted to hide him in the library where they tutored him, and that's what they ended up doing. They even had access to a safe house, and for some reason never took him there. That was where I thought they were going to take him. And at this point, I still had no BBG. I was just kind of going with what they were doing. So they left him in the library by himself, and they paid the librarian to continue sending food to this room, which wasn't a secret room, it was just a back room. And then they left town on another quest and completely forgot about him. And it is now a year later out of game. We've had so many sessions, and then they finally make it back to the city, and I had designed it to where like he went on trial, he was found guilty, he was set to be hung for his crimes. So the party walked into him actually being hung, and he had sworn his fealty at the hanging to the god Merkel. and he now became an undying warlock mixed with a vengeance paladin and very powerful and everything. So they basically saw him become the avatar of Merkel, and he, as soon as he kind of became this avatar and came to the material plane, he leveled the entire area. It was like a 120-foot area. He had an aura of death essentially around him, which killed pretty much all the commoners that were in the area that were there for the hanging. And then he resurrected them as zombies, so they had to fight a zombie horde. And so that kind of became the thing. And what I wasn't expecting is they're still advocating for, like, they're still on his side. They're like, no, he was innocent. He's still innocent. Like, he was tricked into this and everything. So I'm kind of really curious how this goes down. And I'm just kind of playing it by ear. They now think there's a war going on in my game, and they now think Merkel's been behind the war this entire time. I didn't even have that planned out, so now that's planned out, you know? So they came up with all sorts of theories the last 2 sessions we've had that I've been writing down notes for.
You're gonna mine that stuff, man.
It's been great.
That's the juicy stuff right there. I love that just kinda starting out with, a couple of things for the players to do and then just seeing what happens because something almost always happens that you can use, or like you said, the players start spitting theories out and you're like, "Oh, write that one down, write that one down. We'll
Mhm.
take this one, but we're gonna tweak it just a little bit so that they're close."
Right, and see, now they think the whole council is, like, somehow, so they've got another bounty that's a vampire. They think she's related to Merkel, like, that whole situation somehow. And they think the council members that are against the lord of the area are also vampires that are, like, in cahoots with Merkel somehow. Like, their theories were running wild last session, and it was fantastic. I love those moments as a DM.
So you mentioned, you started this campaign. I'm curious, how long does a typical campaign run for you? Or maybe they're all different.
Yeah, it just kind of depends. I've had a couple campaigns that didn't last very long because people either dropped out or the campaign just got kind of weird. Like the last campaign I ran, it ran for a little bit over a year, about a year and a half, and it was an evil campaign. They were allowed to play evil characters and whatnot and just kind of run wild. It wasn't meant to last very long anyway. But it kind of started becoming very chaotic because wish spells started getting used, and there was like so much going on that I couldn't keep track of what was happening as a DM, and it wasn't fun for me anymore, and it wasn't getting, it wasn't fun for some of the players anymore as well. So that's why we started fresh with a new campaign. But before that, my first campaign lasted probably good 6 months. And once I started getting the hang of DMing, I started a new campaign. And that was, the official homebrew world that I was making a map for and everything. And that campaign lasted, I think, 2.5 years, maybe a little bit longer. And that broke up because people, had to quit because of jobs and other adult life things. So
I mean, 2.5 years is a long
mhm,
that's a long time and stuff changes over that period, like
right.
you said.
Yeah, for sure. And this campaign's been going on for, I think, about a little over a year, probably about a year and a half now. And they're level 9 because they just leveled up 2 levels because of what they did with the castle siege. I was so impressed where I just kind of let them level up. So that's been fun so far.
And so when you get to kind of the end of your like main overarching story, then is that when you would then wrap up that campaign and then potentially launch a new one?
Yeah, just because, I mean, once you reach a point, I think, in a campaign, like with levels and stuff like that, I've never had a campaign reach level 20. So I've never gotten to have that kind of closing moment in that sense. But my first campaign, how I kind of ended that, because the players knew a transition was happening. They knew we were going to start a new campaign. They kind of knew when their last session was and everything. What I had happen was they ended up going on a quest and they saved the Raven Queen who was kind of trapped. And the Raven Queen ended up leveling the whole city or the whole island, and it killed the players in the process. Well, she offered them the ability to be reborn into a new life, into a new body, with or without memories. So I transitioned that into the new campaign, and I had one player who didn't have memories but was a follower of the Raven Queen, and I had someone else who was also a follower of the Raven Queen, and it kind of helped that story start because I connected both campaigns. But it still started a new campaign because they were kind of new souls, but not really.
Yeah, I like having that kind of tie over. Did you give them anything like special as a starting character from that, or just the backstory hook in?
I think I allowed them to have like a common and an uncommon magic item or something like that. I can't fully remember. It's been probably a
It's
good
been a
5
while.
years, so but I think I let them start with some kind of magic item.
Yeah, I think those really long campaigns where one ends and another one begins are really cool. I haven't been able to run any quite like that have lasted and have continued on to, a second season, I guess, if you will. But it's always really cool to hear people talk about ones that they're running or have played in that have done that.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. I'm not sure how long this campaign's going to be running, but I figure, they're already level 9 after about a year and a half. I'm hoping, it's going to run another year or two, and it's going to be a sad day when we end the campaign, but it's definitely going to be interesting to see where it goes. And that feeling of starting a fresh new campaign is really nice too.
What level do you start your characters at? Or did
Um,
you?
they started at level 4. I believe. I have. Yeah, because we kind of had a debate on where they should start. I was going to start them at level 3, then they asked for level 5. I'm like, okay, let's start at level 4. We'll just compromise. Before that, the other campaigns started at level 1, and I found that I couldn't really play or put them against fun monsters. It was always we have to start with like a goblin or two or a kobold or two, like the really low level stuff that can be fun but can also be incredibly deadly to a low level party, especially a level 1 party.
Yeah, I feel like with fifth edition, like levels one and two are almost like the training wheel levels to some degree, and then like once all your characters hit third level, the classes kind of come online, and you're starting to get some more like definition there. I know a lot of the campaigns that I've played in have almost all started at level three, just because you feel a little bit more like your character at level three.
Feel like a hero. I think level 1 and 2 are very good for new players, and that's why, like, my first campaign, I started everyone at level 1 because I was still very new to DMing. I still had some new players that were also very new to the game or completely new. So it was easier to start them at a level that, level 1, we're all starting at, the base and going from there and learning from there. But now I've got all of my players are experienced players that have been playing for quite a while. So it's easier to start them at a higher level when they understand the game and understand how to balance their character if they've got more spell slots and things like that, like all their extra stuff they get at level 3.
Right. And how frequently do you let them level up? And then is it also like milestone leveling, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, I do milestone, and I do have a general idea of where I kind of want them to level up. They've gotten better at it, but my players have a really bad habit of letting things draw out way longer than they should be, and I'm still getting better at that as a DM, is kind of honing people back in. So I'm still learning, but they, up until a few months ago, they were still only like level 5 or level 6. Like they hadn't really leveled up because they hadn't done much in the campaign. Well, now they're kind of kicking their butts in gear and actually getting stuff done. And so now they've had a lot of level ups in a very short amount of time because I told them that if they want to level up, they have to earn it. So they started actually accomplishing things in the game, and I try to have them level up when they've done something major or actually accomplished one of the quests that they set out for. So they've got a quest to defeat this vampire that they know about. They had a quest to help a town. Once they were done with the town, they leveled up. There was a quest that kind of started after that of helping the town or the city through a castle siege and kind of getting them through all of that. So, but because they impressed me, they leveled up twice. Like they heavily impressed me. They outsmarted me. So, once their next level up is going to be once they kind of defeat this vampire lady. But and that might be something that might not happen for a while. So I might develop, I know that is a milestone that will happen at some point, but through the course of dealing with what they're dealing with currently in game, they might inadvertently create a new milestone if they create a new major quest and like major plot point just through what they're doing. So I kind of play it by ear with how they level up and how I determine the milestones. Kind of the same way I determined the BBEG.
Yeah, I like that. I'm curious about this castle siege and how you ran that.
Very chaotically, very nervously. It was the first time I ever ran a castle siege. So I looked a bunch of stuff up. I asked people questions and asked far more experienced DMs for advice. And I had a lot planned out because it was going to be all role play for the most part. What I basically had set up was once the castle siege started, once they heard the alarm bells going off, that was telling them that this is starting. And I had a 10-minute timer up on the TV. And at the start of the timer, and I explained it all to them once it was ready to start. So at the start of the 10-minute timer, I'm like, an event is going to happen. Either something is going to happen on your guys' end that's major, or something the opposing army is going to do. Something is going to happen. And you're going to have 10 minutes to figure out what you're doing as a response. So whether it's increasing fortifications, if you're, having people set up along the walls, like what are you doing to make sure that you can counteract whatever is about to happen? And then they're going to roll percentiles, and depending on how they roll on percentiles, that's going to tell me how well they do with what they had planned out. They kept rolling very, very well. They're far more military minded than I am, I found. I'm getting asked questions where I'm like, "I don't understand what you're asking me." So I found I was very underprepared for it, even though I felt like I was very confident that I was prepared and everything. They kinda upshowed me, and so I had a list of things that were events in the sense of, like, the first event was the party could see the actual army off in the distance approaching. One of the other events was, they start breaching the wall. Another one was they kind of get through the sewers and they start infiltrating the city that way. One of the first ones was they have hill giants carrying a big log to kind of get through the city gates, and I had given them earlier an immovable rod that they just randomly found, and I kind of forgot about it, and they put that in front of the gates so that the gates couldn't break open. And I thought that was fantastic. And they had ended up ending the castle siege very, very quickly, quicker than I thought they would. They rolled very well. And then they had befriended dragons earlier in the campaign, and they used an item that I had given them to get to the dragons almost immediately and brought the dragons and recruited them. They rolled very high, over 20, to convince them to come back. And so dragons entered the battle and the battle was won. It was a fantastic time, but they outsmarted me a few times. So
But it was very different than like a typical D&D session as well, right? Because you had, it was like in real time, you've got these events that are ticking down. And it sounds like you did have roles, I guess, but it wasn't like they weren't looking at their character sheets so much as like, here's like, what do you tell everybody else to do in the next 10 minutes or so? It sounds like a really cool event. I assume that your games are in person?
Yes.
Or okay. It almost sounds like an escape room in a way, but, like, different.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I even told them, I'm like, "You guys, you can tell me. I'm not gonna make you roll for anything. Like, you tell me what you are doing to be cool in this moment, and you can do it. If you want to do some flip kicks around, and you're hitting people square in the face with some arrows, you're doing this, that, whatever you want to be doing right now, you will accomplish." And it was designed as a moment. They were always going to win. They were always going to get through the castle siege. Their side was always going to win. I had that determined from the beginning, and it was designed as an encounter to make my players feel powerful, to feel smart, to feel like the heroes that they are and everything. And that was what I wanted the session to be, and I really feel like I accomplished that.
So how long did that session run, roughly?
That session, I think, only lasted maybe 4 hours, and it wasn't the entire. They had their whole event with the BBEG happen first, and then they had the castle siege happen. So the castle siege itself only lasted maybe 2.5 hours.
Nice. And I guess, what is a typical session? How long does that go for you?
We plan for 4 or 5 hours, but at the end of the session, when it kind of gets to that time, I will ask my players, "Hey, do we want to push on or do we want to end for the night?" Sometimes we push on, and we've had 12-hour sessions before, or sometimes we have to end early. But we usually try to shoot for 4 or 5 hours so people can get home. And I've got a couple players that have about an hour and a half drive, so.
Yeah, that gets to be a lot.
Mhm.
I know a lot of our sessions tend to be not nearly that long, but I mostly play online just because of geographic location for everybody that I play with. So I do know when we have people over for board games and stuff though, it's like we're sticking around as long as possible because we don't get to we don't get to meet up like
Right.
this that often. And if we're gonna spend the time to, drive to somebody's house, like we're gonna
Mhm.
get as much time out of it as we can. So
Right. And we started meeting earlier in the day just to kind of have that buffer time in case people want to stay later. So sometimes, we start at 4 in the afternoon, and sometimes we play till 8 or 9, and then there's other times people don't leave till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning.
yeah, I've definitely been there with in-person stuff. So but those are really fun times to have with friends.
100%.
Well, we are getting really close to time here. Let's see. Is there anything else that you would like to mention about DMing, running games, prep, homebrewing, anything like that before we wrap up?
I would just say, for like people that are especially new DMs, don't don't over prep. Prep enough that you don't feel like you're going to be saying every 2 minutes, because I've had those moments. But you want to prep enough that you have something to go by, but your players are going to drive the story. Let them be the ones to determine the story as well, because like them having all these ideas for what they think is going to be going on in the campaign and everything like that, I'm going with, because there's nothing better than to see your players have their aha moment and then know later on that they were right because you let them be right.
I love it. Well, it's been great having you on. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find you online?
But yeah, so I've got a Discord, a YouTube, I've got an Etsy, a Patreon. I've pretty much got any type of social media: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of that. I've got a link tree pretty much in all my socials. So, and it has everything on it. I post the most on TikTok. I just opened a Discord, so I'm still very new to that, and I just started a YouTube, so those are still very new. I'm pretty much on all of them. I'm either Arcane Mirage or the Arcane Mirage.
And I'll get that link tree from you and we will put that in the show notes so that everybody can easily find you.
Yeah, for sure.